Hello, everyone. Hi, I'm Tom Wormuth. I'm the director of the Hudson River Valley Institute here at Marist College. I want to take this opportunity to here tonight to the annual Handel-Krom Lecture in Hudson Valley History and Culture. This lecture is done through the generosity of Shirley Handel, Bernard Handel, and the late Gilbert Krom, retired lieutenant colonel. The Handels themselves could not be here. Well, actually, they are here tonight. They are here via Zoom, as are about 120 other folks who are watching this lecture here tonight. But they did want me to read just a few remarks since they themselves could not be here, and I'd like to do so. And this is Bernard and Shirley Handel, longtime benefactors not only of Marist College, but of the Mid-Hudson Valley more generally. Good evening and welcome, the Handels say. Tonight, the Bernard and Shirley Handel Foundation, in conjunction with the estate of Colonel Gilbert Krom, are presenting our 2023 lecture presentation on Dutch history in the Hudson Valley. We have endowed this series for many years in honor of the over 400 years in which the Krom Newkirk family has lived in Ulster County, except for Shirley's years at Stanford University and Gilbert's many years in the military, including combat in Korea and Vietnam. The Handel Foundation has also endowed similar annual lecture series on Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt and Holocaust and genocide programs. These lecture series have provided the opportunity for speakers who are known leaders to visit our local colleges and meet students, faculty, and our community. And tonight's speaker, Dr. Nicole Saffold Maskiell, who I will introduce a little bit more fully in just a minute, certainly meets that standard, and we welcome her. She will be introduced in just a few minutes. We want to thank Andrew Villani, again, this is the Handel speaking, Executive Director of the Hudson River Valley Institute, for arranging for our speaker and the entire program for this evening. Special thanks to all at Marist who are always so helpful and efficient. Also thanks to Colonel Jim Johnson and to Dr. Tom Wormuth for their great direction of the Institute for many years, and to Chris Del Giorno and his development staff. Now, this lecture, this is back to me now, is offered through the aegis of the Hudson River Valley Institute here at Marist College. This is the 21st year of HRVI, and the mission of the Hudson River Valley Institute is to promote the study of the Hudson River Valley, its history, its culture, its art, literature, environment, all the things which make the valley what it is, this rich landscape of historical sources and materials. We do this in a variety of different ways. We do this on the one hand right through the curriculum here at Marist. We have a Hudson River Valley Studies program. We have a minor in Hudson River Valley Studies. There are several students here who have completed that minor, so the curriculum at Marist focuses around those things. In other ways, too, we work with local teachers, but also we have our digital library, the HudsonRiverValley.org, HudsonRiverValley.net, a collection of hundreds of thousands of pages of historical materials and records there for one's use. We have the Hudson River Valley Review, which is published twice a year. I do not have a copy of it here, which I would shake for you to see. The autumn issue is about 2 weeks out, the editor tells me, and I think there are issues which will be outside as well. But even with all of these different types of things which the Institute and Marist is involved in, really our favorite is this type of environment. It's a live environment in which a speaker is presenting their research on a particular topic. They're doing so in an audience who gets a chance to question, some nice discussion, collegial discussion back and forth. It's really kind of it's central to the academic experience, and that's what we'll have tonight. Now, I do want to mention a few folks who are here as well. There are several members of the Hudson River Valley Institute Advisory Board that are here. Elijah Bender is here. He's a Marist graduate. Frank Doherty, Colonel Jim Johnson, the Emeritus Dr. Frank T. Bumpus Chair of Hudson River Valley History, and former Executive Director of the Hudson River Valley Institute, up from Kentucky for this event. President Kevin Wyman is here, I just saw there. In addition to the group assembled here this evening, we also have a large group of folks across New York and the country. Again, over 100 that are on Zoom, including Hawaii, joining us. So a special hello to them, since they will also have that opportunity to ask questions. I would also like to acknowledge the work of HRVI Executive Director Andy Villani and Senior Program Director Chris Plazowski in putting together everything for the 12th Annual Handel-Krom Lecture in Hudson River Valley History. Tonight, we will be using a question and answer, Q&A, that will include both in-person audience here, you folks, and also the Zoom audience. So for Zoom attendees, for the Handels and others, wherever the cameras are right now, any questions that you have for Dr. Maskiell, please put in the chat section, which we'll be monitoring throughout the program. And now on to tonight's speaker. Dr. Nicole Saffold Maskiell is an associate professor of history at the University of South Carolina in Columbia and author of Bound by Bondage, Slavery and the Creation of a Northern Gentry, just out late last year from Cornell University Presses, one of the most prestigious presses in the United States. She has appeared on C-SPAN, the podcast Ben Franklin's World, and in a historic Hudson Valley documentary film about the life and legacy of Margaret Hardenbrook Phillips, an early female trader and enslaver. She is the series editor for the upcoming book series Black New England from the University of Massachusetts Press, which highlights research on the history of African-descended people in New England from the colonial period through the present. Please join me in welcoming our speaker tonight, Dr. Maskiell.
Thank you so much for coming this evening, and I'm really excited to be here giving this talk. To be in the place where it happened is quite exciting indeed. And of course, now we can't use that phrase without thinking about Hamilton. Okay, so I wanted to start in talking about what I have to talk about today in this network's kind of at the beginning of this journey for myself. And my beginning, it came in ways that I think a lot of people can relate to, and that's through family history. And family history really motivated me to explore the history of enslavement more generally, and New York's past in particular. My in-laws live on this sprawling stretch of land in the Hudson Valley, which you can see pictured here. And during a stroll up the mountain with my father-in-law, he pointed out several of the small walls that dot the property. If some people have lived in the Hudson Valley, you might see these small kind of colonial walls. And he kind of thought, and we were talking about maybe some of them dated back to the colonial era. I wondered about the people who built these walls. And this is about the same time that they were doing research into the wall down in Manhattan, and how some of that research showed that it was built in part using enslaved labor. The land that we stood upon when making this conversation was part of the Phillipsburg patent, and of course is the ancestral land of the Mohican people. And this Phillipsburg kind of claimed land patent, which was, of course, part of the holdings of one of New York's largest enslaving families, the Phillipses. It made me start to wonder who built these walls, right? These walls that were so closely tied to me and to broader family history. I wondered if they had been bonded or indentured or enslaved, or if they, like me, had West and West Central African roots. In today's talk, I'm going to talk about taking you basically on my own journey of discovery. And in so doing, I want to ask the questions that guided my own inquiry into the past. And today, I hope that I'm going to tell tales that feel both familiar but also strange, and kind of take a walk down the thought process that I took in order to come to some of the central questions that guide my research. And I will be giving 3 of those questions kind of center stage tonight. The first is, who is at, oh, sorry, I've gone the wrong direction now. The first is, who is at the center of historical inquiries and why? How do archival collections shape the type of histories that get discussed and discovered? And then finally, what can be learned about enslavement and memory in the Hudson Valley by reading documents and some old and familiar collections against the grain? So I want to talk a little bit about a hidden history, but I want to do it by starting with the familiar. Names like Philipsa, Stuyvesant, Van Rensselaer, Schuyler, Livingston, Bayard. These names are going to recur throughout today's talk and are some of the most famous in New York history. Just riding down the interstate, or walking through the streets of New York City, or heck, listening to Hamilton, right, on whatever music player of your choice, will give you a passing familiarity of some of these names. The Phillips family were extraordinarily wealthy men and women whose fortune was built in no small part on the backs of enslaved people. Peter Stuyvesant was the last Dutch governor, or more specifically, Director General of the colony of New Netherland, which at its fall included the Caribbean islands of Curacao, Aruba, and Bonaire. The Van Rensselaer family were the owners of Rensselaerswyck in the upper Hudson Valley, a massive landholding that we will be talking and returning to throughout today's talk. Nicholas Bayard, Petrus's nephew, was New York City's 16th mayor. And the Schuyler family really need no introduction at this point, but they became prominent landowners in and around Albany. They intermarried with the Livingstons in the late 17th century, amassed landed wealth, were involved in indigenous relations, and would famously go on to become pretty important during the American Revolution. But these names are most frequently associated with politics, land owning, maybe old money, even, as I said, indigenous history. But as a historian of early American slavery, I became fascinated by the prominent place in the history of the region that these families had in the history of regional slavery, and how truly interconnected they were. So I was drawn to these famous stories through an alternate pathway, and was interested in telling an integrated story to try to reconstruct a sweeping narrative of the lives of the enslaved. Now, this leads me to my first question of the day, and that is, who is at the center of historical inquiry and why? Now, for the history of the Northeast, there is a paper trail several centuries long filled with tales of prominent families. But trying to get a different perspective required reading documents in different ways. And I'm going to talk about one of those ways a little later on, reading against the grain, as it's referred to in the academy. Now, African and African-descended populations have historically been approached as marginal to this main historical narrative. For example, this is the image that appears on the front cover of my book and has captivated local historians of early New York for a long time. It depicts what some have argued, though we're still kind of trying to figure this out, is one of the earliest images of a Black boy in Albany. And this boy is depicted behind the foregrounded figure, a young Van Rensselaer family child. Now, for years, paintings like this one depicted enslaved people as part of the canvas, but it's only been in the last few decades or so that such images have come to be centralized and examined in a big way. And of course, in the past few years, this has really led to an explosion that has not been without controversy, which I think is important to point out. So I want to kind of return to my own experience of doing this kind of work in the archives, because the evidence of enslaved people's lives in early New York lay in weathered, and in the case of many documents damaged during the fire that happened in Albany in the early 20th century, sometimes burned manuscripts. And these manuscripts were written in Dutch and in Dutch handwriting. Take, for example, this letter written by Jeremias van Rensselaer, a member of the extraordinarily wealthy Van Rensselaer family of Amsterdam, who made their money in precious gems and investments in the Dutch West India Company. Now, they were large landowners in what is now Albany and its environs. In the summer of 1661, Jeremias sat down to pen a letter to his elder brother, Jan Baptiste, where he devoted over a half a manuscript page, which you can see right here, towards complaining about an enslaved man he had sold to the governor or the director general of New Amsterdam, Petrus Stuyvesant. Now, he referred to the man not by name, never by name, but by an array of derogatory terms. For example, the beast had faced a foul, useless beast, an onnodig beest, a clumsy oaf of a nigger, een lomflevliger van een nigger, and a dumb beast, een domme beest. These are some of the descriptors that Jeremias used. He also said the man had a mouth like a flounder when he grinned, which presumably was meant to disparage the man's appearance, perhaps his lips. Jeremias complained that the man could do less work than a child, despite looking fit and eating as much as 3 men. And he even said that he regretted the man had not died when he'd earlier fallen ill. Such language shockingly revises the images of early American colonials like the Van Rensselaers. But these interactions were not unique, and expansion would spread these notions far and wide. Enslaved people were involved in the expansion of Dutch colonial reach to the lands south of New Amsterdam. The southernmost portion of New Netherland lay along the Delaware River Valley between modern-day Baltimore and Philadelphia. Formerly known as New Sweden, the South River Colony was captured by Dutch forces in 1655 and incorporated into a broader colony of New Netherland. Local administrators saw the value of enslaved labor to their efforts to grow the colony and requested that, quote, 50 Negroes who are particularly adapted to the preparation of the valleys and other heavy work be sent to that settlement by the Dutch West India Company. Now, these enslaved people were intended to be the core of the agricultural workforce that would advance the productive output of the valley. Now, the Stuyvesant family story remains really omnipresent in the history, lore, geography, really the origin story of New York, as Petrus was the last Dutch governor of, or director general of the colony. Well, you can see statues and dedications to him from Amsterdam to Friesland, Willemstad, Curaçao to New York City. His story had rarely intersected in any meaningful way with the story of enslavement. Indeed, Petrus was a slaveholder, and as a Dutch West India Company official and leader of the colony during a time when slaving numbers were on the rise, he was someone who had the administration over a large number of enslaved people. We can see, at least through the pen of Jeremias van Rensselaer, some disdainful things he had to say about one enslaved man. But who is at the center of historical inquiries matters. And in this next section of stories, I want to illuminate how expanding the gaze beyond Petrus, beyond Peter Stuyvesant, deepens our understanding of the past. Now, by the time that Petrus was requesting the labor that the man Jeremias enslaved, he was already a family man. His domestic world included his wife Judith and 2 sons, Balthazar, who was 13, and Nicholas Willem, who was 12. The story of the Stuyvesant family, who would fan out across the Caribbean, South America, and ultimately, when the United States became a country, the Southern United States, was one that was both unexpected, but became a familiar pattern in my documents. But what I found was shocking, and what really compelled me, was that white female networks were crucially important to the spread of these families' reach, and specifically in enslavement. Petrus's sister, Anna Stuyvesant Verlet's family really uncovered the importance of these female kin networks to the spread of enslaving networks southward. She married the slave trader Nicholas Verlet, who, while stationed in New Amsterdam, maintained Chesapeake contacts. Her new husband's sister, Anna Verlet, married Dr. Joris Hack and relocated to the Chesapeake, becoming large landowners and enslavers. They held considerable property on Virginia's eastern shore, including a 900-acre plantation on Punkatea Creek, a 400-acre plantation on Machatonk Creek, and 100 acres on surrounding islands. Now, The Stuyvesant family held property throughout what is now New York and New Jersey, but lived on their properties in the island of Manhattan. Petrus Stuyvesant had a grand stone mansion built on Manhattan during his tenure as Director General, but that residence was seized by the English as part of the colony's capitulation and the city's fall. They also had a Bowery house, which was this two-story structure that actually stood until the 19th century. And you can actually, when Ben Franklin comes to do his tour of New York, he talks about seeing the old Stuyvesant mansion, and that was kind of a landmark that he was able to see during that tour. The Stuyvesant family remained in the Bowery house for a century before it was destroyed in a fire in New York City, along with most of the Stuyvesant family papers. Now, even though she's rarely the focus of historical inquiry, the management of the Stuyvesant household would have been the primary responsibility of Judith Stuyvesant, Petrus Stuyvesant's wife. And we actually can see a little bit of a hint of this when the city falls and Petrus is sent back to Amsterdam to basically answer for why the city fell to the English without a fight. Without a shot, he leaves the care officially by law of all of his holdings to his wife in his absence. Judith had been born in Breda, where she lived until meeting and marrying Petrus on August 13th, 1645, and moving to New Netherland in 1647. The house was surrounded by a multi-ethnic village of people, including free Black people who'd been settled there at the conclusion of the war with Esopus, who is a local indigenous group, in 1659 and 1660. The brick Bowery house sported glass windows that looked out into a varied terrain, including marshes, meadows, and orchards. It was also a site of enslavement. When the West India Company granted Petrus the Bowery in 1648, it came with the unfree labor of 2 enslaved Black men. We also know that 3 Black women were tasked with cleaning Petrus Stuyvesant's house as a condition of their freedom. The stories of early Black women and their connections were crucial to uncovering a fuller picture of this early New York for me. Now, we know the names of these women who toiled for the Stuyvesant: Maiken van Angola, Lucretia van Angola, and Susanna Tambour, because they petitioned the council for their freedom. And it was granted, with the caveat that they continued to clean the Stuyvesant's house. The compelling story of Maiken and her friends has featured in several accounts of New Netherlands' early life. Maiken herself was likely one of the first 3 enslaved Black women to be brought by the Dutch West India Company to the colony, and her name is one of the first references we have to an enslaved person in the documents. Her first name, Maiken, connects her to this broader Dutch diaspora, and her last name, Angola, connects her story to West Central Africa. She was enslaved by the Dutch West India Company for 3 decades of her life, a fate that connects her story to generations of people pulled into the vortex of enslavement by the Dutch company headquartered in Amsterdam. And you can actually go today, if you'd like to Amsterdam and see the Dutch West India Company headquarters. We know that during her life in the colony of New Netherland and in later years, English New York, she lived within a community of African and African-descended people, was married to a free Black man named Domingo Angola, and when he died, she got married again in what is likely her 70th year to another member of that free Black community, and stood as baptismal witness alongside white Dutch colonists for an African-descended child in the community. She is rightly understood as important and a founding early American woman who fought for and won her full freedom. In some ways, then, Maiken and her friends' experiences were exceptional. They were married, they attended the Dutch Reformed Church, and were able to sue for their freedom in court. But their lives also reflected the struggles of existence within a system of bondage and unfree labor. Make no mistake, cleaning the Stuyvesant's house was hard. work. Special tools were necessary to clean windows, sweep stoops, and other dirty jobs. It was physical work that required hoisting, pulling, carrying, scrubbing, laundering, and bending. Judith Stuyvesant's will, dated January 29th, 1678-9, and proved the 15th of March, 1686, gives some evidence to some of the items Micah, Susanna, and Lucretia could have been tasked with cleaning, including furniture and dishes, china earthenware, 3 great pots, a black cabinet of ebon wood with a foot or frame belonging to it, as well as clothing like linen, and Judith wearing apparel of silk and woolen. Ebony cabinets were maintained by rubbing waxes and oils into the wood. During the 17th century, linens were laundered by hand in the waterways. Deep cleaning required urine, lye, boiling water, paddles, or washboards, a taxing process that affected the health of working women. Now, while Micah approached the court again, Susanna and Lucretia had died. Precious little has been reconstructed of Susanna and Lucretia's lives and experiences, but the loss of their companionship must have been a grievous blow. They may well have succumbed to smallpox, which raged during the winter and spring of 1662 and 1663. Micah requested to be freed from the obligation of cleaning the Director General's house because it was much too strenuous a job for her, explaining that she was elderly and suffered from an old injury, presumably the result of decades in bondage. Now, Micah's plea, which rested on her years of service and the strenuous nature of her labor, convinced the council, and she was granted her full freedom. She lived out her days in the Bowery community. Others in the community were pulled away by the desires for gain of their enslavers. A couple named Lucia and Joseph appear in a 1659 suit brought against the denizens of New Amsterdam by a Portuguese slaver named Juan Gallardo Ferreira. In it, he lists the names of people he claimed as property who had been seized by pirates and sold to New Netherland. This couple struck me because when they appear in the record, they were already on the island of Curaçao, but the remnants of their lives in New Netherland are still discoverable in the testimony. Lucia and her husband, called Joseph, now in the possession of the company, whom the general has sent to Curaçao to take charge of the cattle and pasture there. Paolo and Diego and Jacob are also sent to Curaçao in the company's service. Now, they were married. They were enslaved by the Dutch West India Company, and they'd been sent to Curaçao from New Amsterdam. They had enough skill with cattle and pasture to be sent by the general, Petrus Stuyvesant, to be put in charge of the pasture at the island. Their forced relocation was far from unique. A few years later, in 1664, Petrus Stuyvesant made brief mention to his vice director at Curaçao, Matthias Beck, of the sale to the plantations in South America of enslaved baptized children who'd been, quote, presented in baptism with good intentions by Judith Stuyvesant. These children had been sent to the island by the Stuyvesants, but through what Beck had described as a, quote, great mistake, were subsequently sold to far-flung plantations throughout South America. Lucia, Joseph, and the unnamed group of baptized children had clearly been members of the Black community in New Amsterdam. Now, while this foundational community of free and enslaved African Americans has been featured in several works highlighting their rootedness in Lower Manhattan, I was intrigued by the journeys of those members of the community sent to labor in what was then the Caribbean portion of New Netherland, Curaçao. Their stories have been used to illuminate the slave trade and, of course, the terrible system of unjust bondage. But I wondered who they were and the New Netherland they would have encountered. What can be learned about them? So I left out of New Jersey on a direct flight to Willemstad, Curaçao. The year that the mention of the loss of the children appears in the record is the same year that Matthias Beck also mentions that the Stuyvesant's eldest son, Balthazar, was being set up on the island of Curaçao. Now, I wondered about why this group was sent down in the first place, which was perhaps to labor on the island as much as Lucia and Yosef had been. And given the intersection of the arrival of Balthazar, I actually wanted to track down Sint-Joris, the place that Matthias had picked out for Balthazar. Now, I have to admit, I had very, very little luck in the archives, which were unexpectedly shut down for renovation during the majority of my visit due to temperature and moisture control problems affecting the documents. Now, I really was about to give up when I decided to get my head out of the archives and actually take a trip around this gorgeous island I was having this amazing opportunity to visit. I ended up on the other side of the island at an aloe plantation that turned out, incidentally, to be serendipitously exactly where Balthazar's lands were. I further learned that in later years, they had become a secondary provisioning plantation where enslaved people who arrived on slave ships on the island were sent to regain some degree of health before being resold. Now, such stories took me from lower Manhattan to the Southern Caribbean, from Dundunki, this place of memory, to the Hudson Valley. The expansive cross-colonial narratives of Micah, Lucia, Yosef, and others changed the way I thought about race, gender, and place. They sent me on a journey of discovery that would shape my scholarly endeavors ever since. In my book, Bound by Bondage, Slavery and the Creation of a Northern Gentry, I argue that there existed an expansive, interconnected, and slaveholding Northeast that was fully integrated into the system of Atlantic slavery. Now, foregrounding the lives of people who have been for generations relegated to the margins is not easy work. It's filled with dead ends and false starts, but it is necessary work with the power to encounter seemingly familiar subjects in new and intriguing ways. During the research for this book, I uncovered a Dutch document cataloged alongside miscellaneous papers. It was literally cataloged as miscellaneous Stuyvesant papers at the New York Historical Society. This document detailing domestic abuse as well as torture directed at enslaved people who lived at the Stuyvesant Bowery was one not cataloged as such, partially, I think, because it was written in Dutch. The testimony was given by Elizabeth Stuyvesant Sydenham, who actually was Petrus's daughter-in-law. She had married his son, Nicholas Willem. And after his death, she was remarried to an English captain named John Sydenham. And by the time she's giving this testimony, her and John were estranged. And she tells a chilling tale of what happened on the Bowery during her time there. She literally said that she lived in hell. She detailed that in addition to abusing her and her children from her first marriage, John would tie the Negroes up and whip them for nothing. Bond de negers op en gezelt them voor niemandsal. This verb, geselen, which translates into English not only as to whip, but to flog or even to horsewhip, conveyed the violence of these assaults. Now, after a bit more digging, I found that the Sydenhams enslaved 10 people at the time. 4 men, 2 women, 2 little boys, and 2 little girls. And even uncovered the names of 2 of them, George and Samson. While Elizabeth's testimony was primarily an attempt to block John's effort at overriding her property claims in New York and Albany, Mohawk and Muncie lands, Elizabeth's testimony opened up for me a world of gender, enslavement, violence, and claimed land. But how might archival focus that fully engages with the impact of enslavement challenge even narratives constructed to address historical silences and inequity? For this, I will turn to the example of the Livingston family. Now, the long shadow of slavery during these early decades, characterized by Dutch rule of a decidedly ethnically heterogeneous European populace, shaped the destinies of later generations, serving as the charter generations to some of the most enduring family dynasties in American history. And one such family dynasty is the wealthy Livingston family, most of whom would ultimately support the American side of the Revolution. Members of this family would go on to endow chairs at Yale and Columbia, be involved in the drafting of the Declaration of Independence, sign this founding document, and even be involved in the United States Louisiana Purchase with France, which would greatly increase the territory of the new country, land that would be used to expand slavery westward. Now, Robert Livingston arrived in colonial America from Scotland in the 1670s. Through his marriage to a wealthy Albany widow, Alida Schuyler van Rensselaer, he was allowed entry into the moneyed Dutch network of New York elites. He defines kind of this archetype of the New York capitalist, a brash land grabber and politician with few scruples and even fewer allegiances, bound only for a desire for legacy. Robert's diversified supply portfolio included merchant contacts with the Mohicans, the Mohawk, and the Onondaga, New England, Amsterdam, and London, in addition to the slave markets of the Caribbean. He was also the local liaison to the Haudenosaunee, along with his in-law, Johannes Schuyler. Robert and his wife, Alida, were a fixture in Albany society, and their property on the corner of State and Pearl Streets became a local landmark after an elm tree purportedly planted by their descendant, Philip, the signer of the Declaration of Independence that I've shown before, planted this tree in the early 18th century, and the tree lived for well over a century before being cut down in the late 19th century. Now, Robert and Alida ultimately split their residence primarily between Albany and a newly built manor in the Hudson Valley, 50 miles south of Albany. In both locations, they held people in lifelong heritable bondage. Nonetheless, this aspect of their lives at the turn of the 18th century was not foregrounded in most of the scholarly literature. In some scholarly retellings, Alida emerges as single-handedly managing Manor Livingston, while her eldest daughter, Margaret, featured in treatments devoted to active 18th century female merchants. Margaret's husband, Samuel Vetch, helmed several military invasions of Canada, backed by Queen Anne, and was ultimately installed as governor of Nova Scotia. Now, slaveholding does appear in aspects of the story of later Livingston descendants. Alida and Robert's second eldest son, Philip Livingston, became the heir after his oldest brother died, and Philip's life story quickly eclipsed even the memory of poor John. Once known primarily as only a merchant, Philip has emerged in recent works as the prototypical Northern slave trader, whose ill-gotten portfolio allowed him and his ilk to become trustee founders of American universities. And of course, I am referring here to Craig Weiler's groundbreaking work, Ebony and Ivy. Philip's younger brothers and sister, Robert and Gilbert and Joanna, likewise marry into the merchant elite, likewise hold people in bondage, and become very interconnected to the political, landowning, and merchant elite of the colony and later of the new country. Now, while they have been memorialized as part of the fabric of the American story, the Livingstons' conflicted legacy has also lingered as part of the narrative. And so, it is to them that I turn to explore the final theme of today's lecture. What can be learned about slavery and memory in the Hudson Valley from reading the Livingstons' massive family papers against the grain? And so I want to start first to talk about the Manor of Livingston. And I like this map because it shows Albany and it also shows Manor of Livingston. It gives you kind of a sense a little bit of the scope of their world. Now, the Manor of Livingston was a community filled with varied people from across the world. And while it was not primarily a slave operation, it was shaped and defined by slavery nonetheless. In 1710, the population of the Manor of Livingston dramatically increased when thousands of refugees from the German Palatine were settled on adjacent lands purchased by New York Governor Hunter. This massive resettlement ratcheted up regional tension with the Mohawk, who saw the population explosion as a very real threat that would erode their holdings and their power in the regions. Robert, who'd hoped to profit from this vast resettlement, instead became financially overextended. He actually passed this fallout to Alida and ultimately to enslaved workers when on July 12th, 1711, he instructed Alida to stop baking bread for the Palatines because they were underwater on their settlement investment due to the shortage of labor. Now, this shortage was caused because of the loss of Palatine labor due to conscription for Queen Anne's War. And the Livingston operation actually baked bread to supply the troops in Boston and Albany. Robert's baking instructions were meant for the hands of 3 enslaved laborers, Hendrik, Thomas, and Dago. Robert insisted that they continue to bake hard brot, or hard bread. Although Robert had been given a victualling contract by the crown to provision the new arrivals with beer and bread, this task fell to Hendrik, Thomas, and Dago. And it was they who would have to face an increasingly disgruntled population when Robert pulled back promised supplies in a bid to save a little money. Now, such news was not taken lightly by the Palatine tenants, who violently protested their reduction in rations. Adding to the tension on the manor, Robert viewed their labor in tandem with those he enslaved when he instructed Alida on September 21st, 1711, to, quote, let the Negroes or Palatines be employed in winterizing the manor's mill pump, emphasizing that it is very important. Now, Alida responded to Robert saying the following: our Negroes have no time to winterize the mill pump because they have to harvest corn and wheat and cut wood for the brewery. Now, the Palatines were tasked with sapping the trees on the Livingston's property to provide pitch and timber for the crown. Unhappy with being settled on the less fertile Livingston lands instead of another more fertile place they'd been promised by Governor Hunter, but remained firmly within the control of the Mohawk, the Palatines were frequently at odds with the Livingstons, a simmering resentment that would break out into a tense standoff. On November 5th, 1711, Alida Livingston wrote the following to her husband, Robert. Mr. Dirk Vessels has arrived here and said that Skipper has fled with his whole family from 8 French Indians who were seen there. Our Negroes have been near the flats, likely the Schuyler Flats, writes Philip. And he sent Indians after them and did not get them, but has Indians out again, and there is a fire watch going on, and there they may catch them if they want to get to Canada. Now, the group of enslaved people who fled in 1711 during Queen Anne's War, if they'd been caught by Alida and Philip's kind of ministrations, they would have been killed under the act passed by the New York Council 6 years earlier, which incidentally included Robert, that prescribed death to self-emancipated people found more than 40 miles above the city of Albany or above a certain place called Saratoga. Now, individuals from this group of escapees managed to remain out of the Livingston's grasp, and Philip was forced to write his mother that they would not come away, and that their decision to flee to Canada was a strategic one. The group had used indigenous knowledge and guides to ensure their success, and although Philip, according to Alida's retelling, sent native peoples to catch them, these slave catchers, Philip later said, would not pursue them in Quebec. These self-emancipators had left Manor Livingston armed with a savvy knowledge of the native French alliances and the political landscape. An abortive invasion of Quebec, helmed by Samuel Vetch, Robert Livingston's son-in-law, a month before their escape, left the Livingston allies and all of the bordering northern English colonies on high alert of impending attack. The self-emancipated people confederated with a, quote, river Indian to enact their escape, likely a local Mohican. Upon arriving in Canada, one sought asylum with the governor of Montreal, Claude Ramsay, and the escapees from Livingston Manor traded information for sanctuary. Now, Robert was informed. They told the French that there were 8 more Negroes from whence they run, and upon which the French had sent 13 Indians to this place in particular to take the Negroes. Robert was desperate enough to forget the threat of insurrection that he'd faced from the refugee residents on the manor from the German Palatine the year before, and he actually armed a troop of 20 Palatines to keep guard on the manor for 5 or 6 days, expecting imminent attack. But the Liberation Party was sent to Albany instead. The enslaved people had escaped not just for themselves, but so that more people might be liberated. Now, Philip, who was managing the family's trade connections in Montreal, communicated as much to his mother, Alida, in a letter dated October 23rd, 1713, saying he could not convince our Negroes there to go home. They said they would rather stay there. And as long as they say that, there's no likelihood of getting them from there except having the Indians steal them, which will cost a great deal. The Indians are quite afraid of the French. Now, although Philip entertained the possibility of kidnapping as an option for forcing back into slavery the newly self-emancipated people he referred to possessively as our Negroes, he knew and they knew that they were covered by the political situation of warfare. Safe in Canada, these self-emancipated people held fast to their newfound liberty. Now, I sought to find out more about the connections held by enslaved people who live in the manor of Livingston. Robert's Wills actually offers a rare time-lapsed catalog of some of the enslaved people who made up the daily texture of Alida and their families' lives. They highlight the prominent role that Alida had in determining the way that property was passed down in the family, including the fates of those they enslaved. Shifting the archival focus not only exposes the deep personal commitment to regional enslavement of colonials like the Livingston, but also places enslaved people at the center of their own lives as actors in their own right, with personal stakes, desires, and family connections. In Robert Sr.'s will, originally drafted in 1721, updated in September of 1722, and revised in early 1723, he bequeathed his eldest living son, Philip, an enslaved family, and I've shown it here. Yost the miller and Mary, his wife, and his son, Hannibal, Yak, Pete, Tam, Pete Block, Mink, and a Negro woman, Sar. Now, I took these names as a starting place and used them to dive into the Livingston papers, searching for any clues of the texture of their lives. Now, although most of the times, I have to admit, those searches proved only fragmentary dead ends, other times they offered some fleeting window into the lives of those enslaved by the Livingstons. Specifically, I was able to uncover a bit more about Yost, Mary, and Hannibal's circumstances. As the miller, Yost held a highly skilled, important place on the manor of Livingston. He was not the only African-descended person who filled such a role, as we know that Phillipsburg Manor also had an enslaved miller. He would have likely apprenticed his son, Hannibal, to this trade. Mary was Alida's maid and could speak Dutch, and so details that come out only upon Alida's decision to, quote, sell her for no less than 50 pounds. If Robert's grumblings are to be believed, then Yost participated alongside two other enslaved men in work slowdowns and sabotages of the grain. In another letter, Alida complains about Yost's behavior. And she simultaneously describes this behavior as both ill and also poor. She wrote to Robert that Yost had been carried out of the forest by Leendert Coyne, a manor tenant, and the constable because Yost was acting pur or purely mad. Alida administered bloodletting and a gut-wrenching emetic that she reported, quote, brought him to his senses. This was as much punishment as treatment, as Robert expressed shock at her assessment of Yost, explaining that he'd never had any problems with him in the past. Alida's actions against Yost were in line with other enslavers who used such treatments to punish enslaved people throughout the Atlantic world. The importance of Yost, Mary, and Hannibal's family's connection to the Livingstons is underscored by the fact that they were the only Black people mentioned in any of Robert's wills with the following formula: man followed by work speciality, a wife who is specified as such, and a child. But their trauma also comes through clearly in the lines of the papers and later versions of the wills. Yost was subjected to torturous punishment, and Mary was sold away from her family, painting in stark colors the world that Hannibal grew up into. Another family, whose matriarch Diana appears in relation to the family that was parceled out among many Livingston family children, makes up the final story that I would like to highlight. Now, this family tree, like that of Yost the enslaved miller, includes the name of enslaved father, Ben. Ben worked in close proximity to the Livingstons. Now, some of Ben's interactions with Alida specifically and the family more generally survive in the correspondence. On October 26, 1711, Alida wrote the following to Robert. I could not get our Negro Ben to Taconic. He's so scared, and I'm also very scared when the night comes, but I hope that God will keep and protect us. Now, despite Ben's fear, his ability to refuse Alida's request also emerges from the interchange. In Alida's relayed story to her husband, the intimacy of shared humanity, mortality, and the fear of death that she clearly held in common with Ben is also conveyed. But the power dynamic in this relationship is unmistakable. And Alida's sway over Ben's family's fate comes through starkly in some following documents. In her daughter's Joanna comment to her father, Robert, which she wrote while in Boston visiting her elder sister, Margaret. She says the following, Sir, my dear mother told me and promised me she would send here Diana's child soon for Miss Alida when I wrote for her. If you plan to send her, pray do it at the first opportunity. That this was Ben's daughter lay hidden in the testimony of the constable in a later case of attempted murder against another man enslaved to longtime manor tenant Johannes Dijkman. Now, under questioning, Leendert Coyne testified that Robert suspected Ben of being angry enough to try to murder him. But Tom reportedly responded that Ben had never said nothing, but that he was sorry his master had sent his daughter to the Vetches. Only one enslaved girl's name, Isabel, listed as Diana's daughter in the wills, appears in Robert's will, written and revised in the early 1720s. That she was Ben's daughter too survives only in the lines of a criminal case, one that ended with the gruesome death at the stake of the enslaved man, Tom. Ben's daughter, who was sent away to Boston to toil for the Vetches and attend little Alida Vetch, Alida Livingston's granddaughter, would have arrived during a particularly virulent measles outbreak, which killed a proportionately higher number of children and enslaved people. Later on, another behest of a little girl who was 2 years old named Dina for his granddaughter Alida appears in Robert Sr.'s credit account book with his son-in-law Samuel Vetch, and ultimately in Robert's finer will. This little girl, whose mother was referenced but never actually filled in, might well have been Ben and Diana's granddaughter, as she carried a variant name of Isabel's mother, Dina. Ben's loss, his family's anguish, and Alida and their daughter's central role in that tragedy offer poignant testimony to the importance of placing colonials like the Livingstons' lives in context. These stories of enslaved men, women, and children who were claimed as property in the Hudson Valley and Greater New York highlight the long and enduring legacy of enslavement that underwrote the establishment and growth of some of the most powerful dynasties in American history. They illuminate the importance of historical approaches in reading, gathering, and evaluating evidence. Who is the focus of historical stories matters, and shifting perspectives can underscore and uncover new lines of inquiry. Where evidence is found likewise matters, because the archives, some of which in the United States were founded and maintained by the same families I've discussed in this talk, are not neutral sites. Such measures have real world stakes because they force us to reckon with the roots of the power structures that uphold our own societies. Thank you very much. Yeah, sure. Here.
We're going to bring you the microphone.
Recently, I was reading in the newspapers and so on, comparing workers in factories and things like that as another form of slavery. Could you expand upon that? in terms of relating to what you've spoken about?
Yeah, thank you so much for this question. I think that I think this is a really salient point to make. A lot of people have talked about kind of the historical roots even of the type of systems that people work under. And a lot of times people will use the comparison to slavery because slavery has such resonance in our culture. And it's because a touch point that most everyone agrees now was abhorrent. I definitely think that slavery, when we're talking about kind of chattel slavery, was a kind of a unique event, but also some of the roots of the working system, even the language that we use, like, for example, the word boss, right? The word boss, that actually is likely taken from Black English. Black people in the Hudson River Valley and in New York would call their white enslavers boss. And so I don't want to say that, sometimes I think that it can be thrown around a lot, but at the same time, to deny the connections of working people, right? To deny the stress and the types of terrible working conditions and the roots of those being in the systems of oppression and slavery, I think is absolutely appropriate. So thank you for that question. Really profound one.
Hi, good evening. I want to know, what is the catalyst that ended slavery in New York, and when did that occur?
Yeah, this is a really, really good question, and it's a long question. There's fantastic research coming out soon to talk about the fact that slavery did die a very slow death in New York State. The catalyst, many people have pointed to being the American Revolution, right? In the wake of the American Revolution, a lot of the former colonies and new states in the North and other places, even in Virginia, started to consider resolutions to end slavery. And in New York, many of the people who were on these committees, some of them are hailing from these same families, right? They're members of these societies, and they start a process of gradual emancipation that has got some fantastic scholarship about it. And this is a co-working of local activists of the Black community, but also kind of a push in the North to also kind of clear the northern states of their Black populace. So you start to see in other places laws being passed that actually make it illegal, right, for Black people to be in the state. This didn't happen in New York per se, but it certainly was kind of part of this movement. New York took a long time, right? It took a long time. The gradual emancipation truly was gradual. I mean, it did happen before the Civil War, but it was a long and torturous process, and that's why you have activists like Sojourner Truth being born in slavery, right? In the Hudson Valley, because of this long process of gradual emancipation. Did that answer your question? Okay, good.
So if we have other questions in the room, just raise your hand. I'll bring you the mic.
Thank you for taking my question. Exactly where did the slave populations come from in New York, say 1600s to 1700? Were they Africans that came from Africa or migrated or shipped from the Carolinas and Virginia and up to New York, or were there actually slavers during those centuries, be them Dutch or British, that East India trading companies or West Indian trading companies, or was there a triangular trade, or were they mostly from the domestic United States?
Yeah, this is a really good question. And it is one that is something that historians love to talk about, which is change over time. This is a question that changes over time. So we're talking about the early decades of the 17th century. We're talking really mid 17th century up through the end of the century. you get enslaved people in the kind of beginning of Dutch settlement in New York, coming from both the Caribbean, but then also starting to come more directly from West Central Africa. So we're talking about Angola. And so you're getting a lot, and you can see this in the documents because you do have Black people who are attending the Dutch Reformed Church and getting baptized and getting married. And sometimes their last names are van Angola, so from Angola. You do get some that say Creole, right? That so you have people coming from the Caribbean or coming from a different place, like say Portugal or other places, or Portuguese colonies. Brazil was another place that you get enslaved peoples coming in to the colony of New York. Later on, though, with the fall of Dutch New York and the rise of English, the English kind of that kind of broadens the scope of where enslaved people are coming from. You actually do get some enslavers, like the Phillipses, engaging in direct trade from with Africa. So they're going to Madagascar. So you've got East Africa being involved in this trade with some of these northern enslavers. Others, like the Livingston brothers, are going to the Gold Coast primarily. And you can see this in the testimony of the New York Conspiracy, where enslaved people are being brought in from in their kind of cultural heritage. You're still getting people from the Caribbean, because a lot of these enslavers also have investments in Caribbean plantations, like the Livingstons have a huge Caribbean plantation in Jamaica and others in Curacao. So, depending on the time period you're talking about, you're getting it from different places. Later on, into kind of the American moment. Of course, once the slave trade is abolished, the African slave trade is abolished, you're still getting some enslaved people coming in from other places, but because of the kind of gradual emancipation of slavery in New York, you're not getting a huge number. So there is amazing research being done trying to kind of track down that population. One interesting point is you do have a huge population of Dutch-speaking Black people, right, in the area, and that's a really profound kind of testament to this enduring kind of connection to this moment of Dutch Atlantic trade.
I'm curious about the relationship between the families you've described and the indigenous population. You've talked a bit about Africans and African enslaved peoples, and I wonder if you could say something about the interactions of the families you were describing here and the indigenous people in the Hudson Valley.
Yeah, thank you so much for this question. In fact, the Livingstons are probably most famously known in terms of kind of for their actions in indigenous relations. Some people have said that the acquiring of Manor Livingston was one of the largest land grabs in American history, and of course this threw into chaos the social and political balance of the Hudson Valley, right? And you get the Livingstons and his in-laws, the Schuylers, working sometimes at cross purposes with the Mohawk, with the Onondaga, and you also have the Mohican retaining hunting rights to the manor. So you have quite a few Mohican people appearing in the documents. In fact, you can see them working alongside, in some cases, enslaved people, right? And then in other cases, you can see the Livingstons and their ilk tapping their connections within the Mohawk, specifically community, to track down enslaved people. But yeah, this is like such a deep history. In fact, much of the history that you can find about the kind of indigenous histories and of course the terrible history of dispossession in this region is being kind of written as we speak.
Was there any relationship with the Vanderbilt family and the Livingstons? Because up in Livingston Manor, I know that there's a well-known trout fishing site that the Vanderbilt's owned. And we also know that Vanderbilt's built the railroad. I
Yes.
assume that that was on the back of slave labor. Was there a relationship between those two families that you're aware of?
Yes, in later years, the Vanderbilts and the Livingstons did intermarry, as did the Livingstons and the Stuyvesants. So you do, there was a relationship there. It wasn't in the 18th century that I've been able to see. But with the Livingstons, they had an early investment in the steamship. So they, they've got kind of this this interest in connecting waterways and connecting and obviously, as you very well point out, the Vanderbilts were definitely invested in the railroad system, which we know, was built on kind of bonded labor, not kind of, but definitely this model of terrible work conditions. So yes, there is a family connection there later on, but not during the period that I'm talking about. That I can tell. Someone might find it, which would be awesome. All right.
Thank you for sharing the stories of the enslaved peoples who worked in the homes of the very wealthy. But my question is that it's my understanding that there was, in fact, you mentioned yourself, somewhat of a freed Black population in New York State and perhaps other parts of the Northeast.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if when slavery was brought to an end, did the free Black population, I mean, we hear about Sojourner all the time, but were there associations, societies, help groups formed to bring the former enslaved peoples into at least a Black society, a working society, people who could be productive and self-supporting and, living on their own?
Yes.
Thank you.
I love this question. And yes, in fact, we've known this from the first decades, even that when there were free Black populations, that they were reaching out to the enslaved community and kind of allowing their houses to be used as kind of a meeting place. We know this if you remember the story of Mykin that I talked about. Her and Domingo are actually brought before the court and threatened with re-enslavement unless they stop doing this, serving as this kind of resource and meeting place. And later on, you have communities built up like Weeksville community and other communities, free Black communities that are helmed by some of these free Black families, like the Peters family that dates all the way back to the first generations of these kind of turtle generations. So yes, you absolutely see that. And there's some incredible research being done now to really uncover the legacy of these communities and fighting for things like gradual emancipation, like civil rights for Black people.
Ended on that note, thank you, Dr. Maskiell, for this excellent lecture, this journey into the depths of slavery. Thank you to everyone here tonight who came out, both here and, well, I guess if you're online, you didn't really come out, but you were watching there. Dr. Maskiell is prepared to sign some books outside, the book which is for sale. So thank you everyone for coming. A special thanks, of course, back to the Handels for their support for this annual lecture series. Thank you very much.